Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to make a balaclava with a fur hood. This is a great design for all types of use. There's a movable inside face cover and also elastic cinches to really close it shut. And this is an easier project, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. If you haven't already, be sure to grab that printable pattern at properfitclothing.com and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need a half yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a fleece, a sherpa, or a sweatshirt fleece. All these materials are easy to work with and they're gonna make for a nice warm balaclava. I'm actually gonna be using 3 different types of sweatshirt fleece. They all have different thicknesses and different styles of stretch. And if you're gonna work with 3 different types of fabric like this, I recommend doing it after your second go at the pattern. That way you can kind of get a feel for your fabric when it comes to stretching it and sewing it around the curves. But like always, since you're making it, get creative with it and use the fabric that you really want to use. You'll need a 1/4 yard of a very fluffy sherpa or a faux fur material. And these furs come in a range of colors, thicknesses, so you may need to do a little bit of shopping around before you settle on the perfect faux fur. The one I'm working with is super thick and fluffy, but it's very hard to serge. So you do want to keep that in mind when you're buying your fur. If you're new to sewing, you may want to get a fur that's less dense. You'll need a half yard to a yard of elastic cord and 2 cord stoppers. The elastic cord is going to be used to cinch the hood shut, and this is optional. If you don't want to add the cinch hood, you can skip this supply. Going along with the elastic, you'll need 6 eyelets, and you can get these eyelets in any size. As long as your elastic cord can fit through them, you're good to go. And again, this is optional. If you don't plan on adding the cinch hood, you don't need the eyelets. And lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape your pattern together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. With all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping the pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results, because the main goal is to get these pages to line up as evenly as possible. And from here, we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting out all of your panels, you should end up with 2 fur panels cut out of your faux fur material. And you can get this material in different colors, different densities. I will say the thicker material is very hard to work with, so if you're new to sewing, I recommend getting something a little bit thinner and kind of working your way up to that thicker material. But we'll get more into that once we start sewing these panels together in future steps. 2 back side panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 back middle panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 middle panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 under loop panel cut out of your main fabric, and lastly, 1 front base panel cut out of your main fabric. Moving on to construction, we're going to start by grabbing our middle panel. And the first thing we're going to do is locate the eyelet placement guides on the pattern and cut those circles out. With both of the circles cut out, we're going to place it on the right side of our fabric and chalk out both of the eyelet placement guides. And what we're trying to do is have these markings fall within that hem guide, so when you fold that edge over, the eyelet marking should be within that hem. Ultimately, this will clean up that raw edge and create a loop for the elastic to be fed through. With the markings in the correct spot, we're going to grab our eyelets, and when it comes to the size of the eyelets, you can realistically use whatever size eyelet you want, as long as it can fit within that hem and your elastic can go through it. Since this is a loose knit fabric, naked eyelets can be ripped out very easily, so I highly recommend grabbing a midway interfacing. This is just going to stiffen it up a little bit so that eyelet has something to grab onto. It's very easy to use. Place it on the wrong side of your fabric over the eyelet guides and press it down. Depending on the weight of your interfacing, this will also slightly reduce the stretch of your fabric. From here, you can snip or punch holes for your eyelets. The eyelet in the hole and add the backing on the back. I'm using a really simple hammer die to install the eyelets. These typically come with the kits and they're very easy to use. All you have to do is feed the base through the right side of the eyelet, slide the hammer portion on the base and hammer it down. After hammering, I always like to flip it over to the right side, stretch the fabric a little bit to make sure it's secured down. If everything is looking good, go ahead and repeat this process for the other eyelet. And the more of these you install, the faster you will get. Before moving on, quickly roll over that top edge to make sure the hem goes past the edges of the eyelet. If it does, we're going to use the pattern as a guide to mark out the hem. The most accurate way is to use chalk, but I just like to kind of eyeball it and pin it down as I go. Or you can press the edge. But what we're going to be doing is sewing the edge down, and I want to walk you through a few different techniques for working with this style of fabric. Starting with the cover stitch machine, this is the machine that's used on mostly all knitwear products that you're going to buy in the store. It's a similar concept to the serger where the thread is going to stretch with the fabric so the thread doesn't snap. Most of these machines give you an option of 2 to 3 needles. in a wide variety of stitch styles. And you use it the same way as a sewing machine. I ran it through directly on top of the seam, so I have a stitch on both sides. You can do it this way, or you can do it on one side of the seam. But as you can see, the back looks similar to a serge, and it's going to have a nice cross stitch, and it stretches without snapping the thread. To get it looking perfect, I do recommend using an edge presser foot and also matching your thread with the color of your fabric. The second option is using just a standard domestic sewing machine. I typically stick to just the straight stitch, but you can mix it up, add a twin needle, and get a similar effect as the cover stitch machine. The twin needle will give you 2 stitches and a zigzag back, so it will allow the thread to stretch with the fabric. For this video, I'll be using the cover stitch. It's a great machine to have around if you're working with a lot of knit material. It gives you a really nice looking top stitch and also the confidence that the thread won't break when the fabric is stretched. I try to line the back directly up with the thread so it covers that raw edge. But if you don't have a cover stitch, you're totally fine using a regular sewing machine. Moving on, grab your under loop panel. We're going to start by doing the exact same thing we did for the middle panel. Cut out the eyelet placement guides, chalk out the guides on the right side of your fabric, flip the panel so the wrong side is facing up, add the interfacing directly over both of the eyelet guides, flip the panel back over to the right side, snip or punch the holes for your eyelets, feed the eyelets through the hole, add the backing, grab the die and hammer it into position. With one side down, move over to the opposite side and repeat all the steps. If you're planning on making a lot of these, I recommend looking into an automatic eyelet machine. Slide the panel up and grab your middle panel. At the top and bottom of both panels, you'll see connect to. Place the right sides together, lining up this edge, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And real quickly before we get into sewing, we're going to be using a serger for this project. These are super great for knit fabrics. They allow you to sew stretchy fabrics without breaking the thread. And another great thing, they also cut and clean up the edge as you're sewing. All in all, giving you a more professional look. But if you don't have a serger, that's totally fine. You can still use your regular domestic sewing machine. All you have to do is switch your machine to a zigzag stitch, adjust the height and width to your preference, and this is going to allow that thread to stretch with the fabric. Both of these methods work great. It's just something to keep in mind if you plan on selling these, because the serger gives you a nice clean cut finished edge. After finishing out the stitch, I always like to double check to make sure both of the layers got stitched together. Sometimes it's easy to miss when you're working with a serger. Moving to the top of the under loop panel, we're going to place the right sides together, lining up both of those top edges, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This next step is optional. We're going to be adding a top stitch, so move that seam allowance to the left or right. It really doesn't matter which way you move it, and stitch on the right side of the fabric directly on top of the seam allowance. And the reason I'm adding this top stitch is because it's going to make it a little bit easier when we're sewing these panels together in future steps. It flattens that seam out so it doesn't get caught up on my serger. Go ahead and place this off to the side and grab your front base panel. Just like in previous steps, we're going to start with the eyelet guides. Chalk out both guides on the right side of your fabric. Flip the panel to the wrong side, add interfacing directly on top of both eyelet guide areas. Flip back over to the right side, snip or punch your holes. Feed the eyelets through the hole and hammer it into position. And like always, repeat this process for the opposite eyelet. Quickly double check both sides. If everything is looking good, we're going to grab the pattern, locate the top edge that says connect to fur panel. With the edge located, we're going to grab both of our fur panels, place them above the front base panel with wrong sides facing up. Find the connect to base panel on the fur panel, and this is the edge we're going to use to sew to the front base panel. And we're going to do this for both of the top edges. We are placing the right sides together, so make sure you grab the right fur panel to line up with the right side of the front base panel. And you can tell this because it kind of makes a curve when the right sides are facing up. Like I said earlier, this fabric is a little bit tricky to work with. You kind of have to move it down and under, but we're going to be stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to be using a straight stitch. This seam will be covered, so you don't have to worry about the raw edge. After finishing up the stitch, double check both sides, make sure that fur layer is locked to the front base layer. At this point, we're going to locate the top edge of both of the fur panels, place the right sides together, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, I'll be using a straight stitch. It's just easier to use with this thick material. But what's nice about this thick material, when you add a seam like this, you don't even notice it on the fluffy side. It blends in very nicely for almost a seamless look. But anyways, moving on, we're going to grab both of our complete assemblies. And what we're going to be doing is attaching both of these assemblies together using that middle circle. Place the right sides together, lining up the top seam. You really want to make sure this is centered so that way the mask is not offset when you finish it up. I generally like to place 4 pins, one up top, one on the side, one on the bottom, and one on the opposite side. Before you start sewing, it's best to check both sides to make sure the layers are actually together. If everything is looking good, we're going to stitch that inside loop at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, I'm using a straight stitch. It's a lot easier working with this fabric, and I know the thread is not going to rip because it's a stiffer material. Plus, this edge will be hidden so you don't have to worry about the raw edge. This is the trickiest stitch of the project, so double check both sides. If everything is looking good, we're going to grab the front base panel and feed it through the loop so the right side is facing out. Do the same thing for both of the fur panels. Push them through the loop so they're on the same side as the front base panel. If your fur is the same thickness, it can take a little bit of time working that edge around. What we're trying to do is line up both edges of the bottom loop. Once you get them lined up evenly, we're going to add a top stitch to that edge. You only want a top stitch on the main fabric, so start at the fur and stop at the fur. Don't stitch directly on top of the fur. This stitch is important because it's going to keep both of these layers locked down to prevent the wrong sides from flipping back out. Flip the panel over so the middle panel is facing up. In this next step, we're going to lock that edge down. So what we want to do is flatten out that bottom section as good as we can, line up the outside edges, and using the pattern, we're going to locate the under loop stitch guide. This is the approximate area of where we want to stitch this panel down. It's not that big of a deal if you don't get this exact spot. The main goal is just to stitch this panel down. Pin down the main panel in the top of the under loop, and I'm going to be stitching on the side of the under loop panel, following as close as I can to the stitch guide. When you flip it over to the front base side, you can see a stitch, so using a thread that matches that fabric will be the best way to go. Next, we're going to fold the middle panel up, line up the outside edges. If you added the under loop stitch in the correct spot, the top of the middle panel should end right before the fur fabric. Line up the side edges for all of the layers and stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. This will lock together all the layers, keep the middle panel from moving around, and essentially make it easier to install the back panels. Before we move on to assembling the back panels, we want to first add the elastic cord. As long as the cord can slide through your eyelets, you can realistically use any size cord. I recommend cutting it anywhere from 30 to 40 inches, and from here you can kind of take it down to your preferred size. Feed the elastic through both of the eyelets on the middle panel. Pull the ends so it's even on both sides. Feed one end through the eyelet on the under loop panel and back out through the front base panel. Do the same thing for the opposite side. Feed the end back through the front base panel, not pulling it all the way through. Grab 2 cord stoppers of any style, and we're going to feed the elastic loop through the cord stopper. This will prevent the elastic from sliding back through the eyelet. Don't worry, we'll be adding one more thing at the end to prevent the cord stopper from sliding off the elastic. To finish off the elastic, we're going to keep it in between both of those panels and run it along that seam so both of the ends meet at the top of the fur panel. And this is where we can kind of play around with the size, adjust it and snip it down. I'm going to overlap my ends to cut down on the size. As long as you have enough elastic to go around the outside of the loop, you should be totally fine. Moving back up to the ends, you do want to overlap these regardless because we're going to stitch them together with the zigzag stitch. After stitching, you do want to pull these very hard to make sure the ends don't rip apart, because if it breaks, it's hard to get back in there and it's not going to cinch closed. Move the elastic as close as you can to the inside seam. If it's popping out a lot, you can pull one side through the cord stopper and you can see as it kind of gets smaller and closer towards that seam. And it may take a little bit of playing around with that elastic cord to get it to the size that works best for you. That's going to complete this entire front assembly. You can place it off to the side and grab your back side panel and your back middle panel. We're going to be sewing the curved edge of the back side panel to the long edge of the back middle panel. Separate both of the back side panels, place the right sides up, locate the curved edge and the long edge. We'll be doing one at a time, so place one of the backside panels off to the side. Place the right sides together, lining up the top edge, and I like to start on the side that's closest to the curve. Since it is a major curve, I don't add any pins. I like to just sew it as I go. Starting at the top, we're going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance and just work around that curve all the way to the bottom edge. And we're pretty much just making a very shallow hood panel. With that in mind, we're going to grab the last backside panel and place it on the opposite side of the back middle panel. Again, starting at the curved edge, we're going to place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, working around that curve. And if you're not using a serger, I recommend using a zigzag stitch for this step because this fabric will be stretched, and you don't want that thread to snap when it's stretched too far. And with all the panels sewn together, we can place this panel to the side and grab our main assembly. We're going to line up the inside edges of the back panel with the outside edges of our main assembly. For the best results, mark the center of the back middle panel so you can line it up with the top seams of the complete assembly. Keep in mind we're lining up the right side of the back middle with the right side of the fur. Place a pin directly on that center point so you have everything lined up. And from here, you pretty much just do the same thing, work towards the center of the side, place a few pins. It just looks so complicating because this fur really gets in the way. You have to stuff it in as you're pinning. If you're using a less dense fur, the step will go much quicker. The bottom width is not going to be exactly the width as the front. This is going to be sewn one side at a time. We'll be starting the seam at the top and sewing to the right, and then starting back at the top and sewing back to the left. Remember, we're sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the reason I'm sewing in 2 steps like this is because with this fur, it's so dense and it's very easy to get offset. I found it was best to just start at the top so it's perfectly centered. Quickly taking a look at the bottom edge, if yours didn't line up perfectly the front and back assemblies, you can actually just snip the back panels so it matches the front assembly. And if yours did this, the reason for it is because when you're sewing on that curve, the fabric will pull a little bit more because you're on a bias and it's going to offset the actual length. I just wanted to throw that tip in there because it's not that big of a deal and it's very easy to correct and fix the next time you sew. But anyways, flip the right sides out and we're going to move back towards that bottom edge to finish it off. What we're going to be doing is hemming that bottom edge, and if you don't want to add a hem and you like that raw edge look, you can move on to the next step. Using the back panels as a guide, we're going to roll that edge over 1/2 inch, place a few pins at the sides and center. Using the cover stitch sewing machine, I'm going to stitch directly on top of that raw edge from the right side of the fabric. If you don't have a cover stitch machine, that's no problem. You can either use a double needle on the domestic machine or a zigzag stitch. This is a stitch that you will get better at over time, and matching the thread with the fabric really helps hide any imperfections. Before we move on to the final step, if you do plan on making any alterations, it's very easy to do. You can add to the length of these bottom panels to make it taller and go down further, or you can add to the sides to make it a little bit wider, but keep in mind you want to taper it out further because it's going to be going closer and further down your shoulders, so you want to keep that in mind. And moving on to the final step, that's branding. I'm just using pieces of leather that's added with double-sided rivets. Feel free to add them anywhere on your finished piece. And like I said in previous steps, I loop them around the loops of the elastic so that way the cord stoppers don't slide off. By doing this, it actually made it easier to use the elastic because I could grab those tabs and pull the cord stopper close. And I really recommend playing around with the density of the fur. You can get totally different looks by just switching that up. But you don't have to add the fur. If you want to just do all fabric, that's totally fine too. This pattern yields great results both ways. And there you have it. Your balaclava with the fur hood is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully yours turned out really good. And if they don't turn out great the first try, it does take practice to really dial these patterns in. Sometimes working with knit fabric, it can stretch weird, it can do different things as you're sewing it to really throw things off. And these little things you will learn as you sew, and you can correct them in time. And I always like to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.